Hello fellow neurohackers. Today we're going to cover a new plugin that came out in VSCode that's called Remote Development, and it's going to help us change the code of FMRIPREP within a container while still being able to use your code editor. I think this will be really helpful for people that want to contribute but don't want to deal with trying to patch their code in a Docker container or trying to debug their code through a Docker container and just want to be able to use a code editor. Visual Studio Code has derived a solution for that. So let's see how it works. First, I'm going to assume that you have Docker installed and that you know how to use a terminal and that you have some basic Python coding knowledge. But beyond that, we're going to start out with forking and cloning a repository. If I click on the fork button here, you can see that I've already forked it, so I'll travel to my fork and I will click on the clone or download button down here. Otherwise, if you hit a fork and you fork it to your profile, it'll take a few seconds, but it should fork it to your profile. Now open up a terminal here, open up a new tab. And I will go to a place where I keep all of my repositories and projects. And I'm going to make another testing dir directory folder. I'll make this a little bit bigger. So I'll make a test FMRIPREP directory. And I will get clone here. And that should take a few more seconds. And with any cloned repository, I like to set up the upstream to make sure I am staying up to date. So I will do git remote add upstream, and I can call that name anything. I call it downstream, through stream, any stream. The name is just a tag to point at this URL. Ooh, actually I need a CD into FMRIPREP, of course. There we go. Now if I do git remote v, I can type git pull upstream master to combine any changes that have occurred. Alright, so I'm already up to date. Sounds excellent. So now let's move on to the next step in this process, which I have a little helper file here, which I'll link. So within this folder, we can, within the FMRIPREP repository, we're going to make a downloads directory. Alright. And we're also going to do a little change to the Docker ignore file that it also ignores downloads directory. That will make sense in a minute when we build our container. Okay, so I can cd into downloads. And now we have a script that pretty much, well, it is a copy paste from the circle CI config from FMRIPREP. If I go into circle CI config, there are a few download steps here in order for the test data to work. So we're going to download that test data ourselves so that we can have it locally. So in order to do that, I'm just going to make a download script myself. Call it download script.sh. Copy paste everything in there. Go out, Control X. And we will run. Sometimes you'll have to do chmod +X download script, and then you can run it. Okay. And I think that's working. But we will see. Open up another terminal. Okay, it does appear to be working. So that will download a lot of the items for regression testing, as well as files that were modified from different OpenNeuro datasets that they also use, or the FMRIPREP also uses for regression testing. That should download everything for us. And while that's going on, we are going to actually open a new tab here. Make it big again, maybe not that big. And what we'll do now is install viascode if we haven't already. And Docker if you haven't installed Docker yet. So if you're on a Mac, you'll install the Mac platform. If you're on Windows, you install the Windows platform. I'm unsure if the tutorial that I'm giving today will work on Windows, but I'm a little bit more confident that it will work on a Mac. And I'm using particularly Ubuntu, so if I had installed Docker, I would click on that one. And then VS Code. I've also already installed VS Code, but I'm on Ubuntu, so I would install the .dev file. And after we install that, I need to open up VS Code within this directory. And we'll click on this extensions, what would you call it, icon on this. I believe they call it the activity bar. So we'll click on this. We'll search the extensions. What we want to install are the Docker extensions, which I've already installed, but you just click install, as well as the remote development. Right here again, you just be able to click install. I've already installed it, so I don't need to do that again. Now the next step is to create a dev container.json file, which is going to specify how we build our development environment through our Docker container. So we'll go into our VS Code and hit Control-Shift-P. And we will say remote containers create container configuration file. So I'll click on that. I'll say from a Docker file. And we're going to change most of this, so it doesn't even matter. And I will simply copy paste all of the steps here into this file. Alright, you can read about the commands in the text on what the different keys and values mean. Mostly the big assumption that I'm making is that you've opened up code inside the FMRIPREP repository, because I utilize the present working directory to know where to place the code folder, that being the FMRIPREP repository. So I'm assuming that this is pointing to the FMRIPREP repository. And I've kind of also created a bastardized command, which will do a variety of things for you, but kind of looks ugly as it's just a one long string with a bunch of ands in there. Otherwise, you can ask questions about what are the different key value parameters and why do we need them. Alright, so with this setup, we can do Control-Shift-T, and we can select Reopen Folder in Container. And it will give us details about how it's building. You can see I've already done this a few times before, so I was able to use the cache steps for a lot of the steps in the Docker file. Starting at copying over the FMRIPREP. So that harkens back to when I went into the Docker ignore to ignore the downloads folder. Otherwise, it would try to copy everything inside the downloads folder into the source FMRIPREP directory, which we do not want to be in that location anyways. As we will see in the .devcontainer.json file, I actually mapped the downloads directory to the temporary directory inside the container. That means everything that's inside the downloads container on my local machine is now accessible in the temp directory in the container. I don't know if that's going to be the quote-unquote best practices of doing this, but it's what's worked for me for now. So we'll wait for this to install everything, and we'll take a look at this step. So this says open folder in container instead of reopen folder in container. The only difference is that this will give you a folder browser that you actually physically have to navigate instead of not having that. And after it's finished building, we will create debugger entries for viascode so that we'll know exactly what data and how we want it to test our viascode installation. See how we're doing. It looks like it's still installing during this step. So I also do something a little wonky here where it installs the FMRIPREP via the container steps. And what I do with the post create command is that I uninstall that FMRIPREP and install it using the setup develop method. So what that helps me with is when we actually put in those breakpoints in our code in source FMRIPREP, it'll actually catch those. It will catch those instead of it being installed somewhere else, where you see in the documentation of FMRIPREP. So if I go into FMRIPREP, read the docs, and go to contributing, we have he simplified it with the patch command, but otherwise it would have to go inside this path, and the code that we would execute would have to go inside this path, and we'd have to open up viascode through this path to actually have the breakpoints operate the way that we expect. So by uninstalling Python and redoing it, I've circumvented that problem. And now it looks like it's getting pretty close. See? Yes, and now it looks like it's getting pretty close to finishing. To create the debug file, we're going to click on this debug icon on the activity bar, and we're going to click on this little gear icon. I don't know why that took me there. Anyways, I just want to create a launch.json file. I'm not going to use any of the defaults that are in there. I'm going to have my own defaults, which are listed down here. So I'm literally going to copy paste all of this information if I can do that. Alright, there we go. I'm going to put it in place of everything in here. And this should give us a debug path for all these programs. You can mess with the commands, you can change them around if you want. Within this Rx parameter, this is literally just passing it into this external program that I'm calling, FMRIPREP binary, so-called. But this will call the code in source FMRIPREP. So if you set any breakpoints, it will break on those points. Well, it'll hand you back control. Those breakpoints function. So test that out. I can go to FMRIPREP command line interface, run, and let's just step over to where it actually tries to run, where it runs the interface. Okay. So I set a breakpoint there. I go to the debug interface. Let's run ds05 and that. We'll begin to run the command here. And we'll see if it gives us control. I'll do some checking of FMRIPREP, and I'll do some checking of the dataset to make sure that it's actually bids formatted. Go through this reference stage, and here we are. So we're given back control, and you have access to all the variables that are defined in this context. So in case you wanted to walk through FMRIPREP and to see how it actually functions and see how arguments are actually passed forward, this will be extremely helpful. And I can have the normal options for debugging, where I can step over, which moves on to the next line, or step into, which will step into this function. If we step into it, we'll go into the NiPipe engine, and we can figure out how NiPipe works from here. We can step over, figure out how things work through NiPipe. We'll stop this for now, since we're not going to actually go through that entire process. Then the other thing that I wanted to show off was the testing. I'll close this too. Go up here. I'll hit Control-Shift-P, and I'm just going to type in PyTest, figure test. Now select PyTest. Now I'll use the existing config file. Now it should show me the new tests when I click on this new beaker icon. So right now it should be discovering the tests for me, looking for them. Guess I'll discover the tests. Let's click on that physically. Now it should have the tests all found. And this is where downloading that data comes to be very useful. And right now I believe it is still analyzing some of the files so that we can debug each of the tests individually. But eventually we'll have a little prompt right here, which will say either to run or debug the tests. Right now we can select them through this interface and say whether or not I want to debug this test. So in order to debug this test, I can again set a breakpoint. Say we want a breakpoint right there. Test remove volumes. I'll say I'll debug that test. Then we'll set up the environment, and we see what we have, the bold file, the number of volumes, and the number of skip vols that we want, so the number of volumes that we want to remove. And again, as before, with the other debugging process, we can step over to the next line, and we can step in to the remove volumes command, and we'll see what's done in the actual function that was defined here. Let's see, out, bold image. So now we have a bold image. And we can also type that in the debug console. We want to see the options, the attributes of the bold image inside our debug console. And if we want to do different operations on the bold image, we can get data from the bold image. It won't look pretty in here, but we can view it. We can assign that to another variable. Bold data equals bold image dot get data. You can see that with the IntelliSense we get all the autocomplete functions that we like. Now we have bold data.shape. It's 88 by 88 by 64 by 50. Okay, that makes sense. Now we can do all different types of operations or write code in here to test our intuition about how things work, or if things aren't working correctly, we can try to do our best on fixing that throughout this interactive debugger. And I feel like that this is just a much nicer way of trying to use a container and a graphical editor to edit your code and to work with it. And I just really applaud viascode for being able to make something like this. I think that is everything that I wanted to show. I showed the PyTest in VS Code, and I showed the normal debugger. And as long as you use these template files, again, you can edit them to fit your exact needs. Again, on Windows, I don't think that excuse me, I don't think that this present working directory will work. And you need to be in the root of the repository for that to work. Otherwise, this should be a pretty standard format that you can use, and it should work pretty well. So in short, it's difficult to have a container and have a graphical editor at the same time. Usually you have to give up one or the other. But with this new application or these new extensions through VS Code, we can have the best of both worlds, where we can use a graphical editor and use a container. I believe that's everything that I wanted to cover. Thank you for listening, and goodbye. Happy hacking.